can you see the chapter chat logo with their lovely faces? Bill, John?
Yeah.
Do we see your faces?
Not
Okay,
in
good.
Yep, we're good.
All right. Welcome. Please make sure to keep your microphone and video on mute. Anyone breaking this rule will be excused from the meeting. The meeting is being recorded. This will be on YouTube later. For credit, please make sure you comment your first and last name, company, and email address. That's how we're making sure that you get credit for these lovely little chapter chats. We will be letting people in as they come on. So if you see someone's video pop up, don't worry, we're going to close it out. Please make sure to comment any questions that you have in the chat or raise your hand. Commenting questions in the chat is probably the best way to go. Feel free to talk to each other, do whatever you want, but do know that even private chats are going to be downloaded by the chapter, so, you know, just be aware of that. We would also like to say a big thank you to our donors for 2020 so far. You know, we've had a lot of events that have gotten switched around and some that are not able to happen, and these companies have donated the funds for events that cannot happen during 2020 that they have already paid for. So we really appreciate that from them. Don't forget, our weekly contest ends tomorrow at noon. It's a selfie. You just have to post a selfie of yourself, selfie of you with your kids, selfie with a filter. Instagram has great filters if you don't want to put makeup on, which I totally get. So just do that and you'll get entered for a $10 Starbucks gift card. And don't forget, we have our first full-length digital educational program at the end of this month, May 28th, at 11:30 a.m., I think. Yeah, I think so. It's an Ask the Attorney panel. We have quite a few people already registered, so if you need to get registered for that, please let me know. If you are a manager and you are looking for tickets, I will be happy to reach out to business partners for you to find a ticket for you. Homeowner leaders are complimentary for that, so please feel free to share those with your homeowner leaders. And here's our lovely little disclaimer. We are not offering legal or medical advice. We recommend that you consult your attorney. This will also be going up on YouTube with everything else. All right, with that, I'm going to let our speakers take it away to introduce themselves and start their PowerPoint.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And my name is John Hansen. I'm with the law firm Bydallen and Jacobson, and our firm represents associations and a variety of aspects as general counsel, and we handle a lot of contract issues for associations, including drafting and interpreting contracts, and so that will help inform our discussion today.
My name is Bill Mann. I'm the president of the GB Group. We're a construction and painting firm. We've been working with homeowners associations since 1980.
Our topic today is part of my French, but that's force majeure. And force majeure is a French term. We'll explain that in a little while, but the goal of today's conversation is to help inform you as to how COVID-19 can be impacting or frustrating your contractual obligations or the obligations of contractors to the association. And we'll be covering what that may look like, some samples, and some things to keep you informed as to how you can deal with this. As a disclaimer, this is for educational purposes. It's not intended to give you specific legal advice or to answer specific questions. And we strongly encourage you to consult with the association's attorney about how you may need to be dealing with these contractual issues and how you can respond to a concern from a contractor or how you can help plan. So it's important for you to be seeking your own legal advice as we go through this. Bill is now going to give us some basic principles of contracts under normal circumstances.
So under normal circumstances with contracts, parties must generally perform. Performance may be excused under certain circumstances, such as like the COVID-19 epidemic that we have. The address in the contract terms that we're going to be covering today, we're going to look at terms such as unforeseen conditions and delays, as well as the term force majeure. These are all kind of important areas you might look in your agreements and contracts, service agreements and contracts going forward. Also, there's some other things that John will mention that just part of the law, but we won't be covering all those today.
The term force majeure is a French term, and it can mean basically superior or irresistible force. It also is often translated in the terms of a contract to describe a situation where there's an uncontrollable event, such as war, labor stoppages, extreme weather, that are not the fault of any party and make it difficult or impossible to carry out normal business. You may find force majeure clauses inserted in the contract to explain what happens in the event of one of these unforeseen circumstances or uncontrollable circumstances rather, and it may be called force majeure, or as we'll see in another example, it can often just be referred to as a delay clause or something that has a similar content or similar intent. But force majeure is the common phrase that we'll see in contracts. We'll first look at a service example contract, and we're going to talk about service versus construction contracts. Service could be, for example, your monthly or annual landscape contract, or your security contract, or a regular service that's being performed on an ongoing basis versus a job, a construction job that's happening for a single defined period of time. This is an example you could find in a service contract, and it says something to the effect of, either party may be excused from its obligations to perform under this agreement if events such as acts of God, domestic war, government regulation, riots or terrorism, disasters or strikes that render such performance impracticable, impossible, or illegal. The excused party is obligated to promptly resume performance in accordance with the terms of this agreement after such force majeure event ceases to the extent possible. So in essence, what this means is there could be circumstances where a party is excused from their performance under the contract if their performance is rendered essentially impossible, that they can't do it. And these provisions will have a variety of different terms, and they're not all the same. Nowadays, I think we're probably going to start seeing these being put in contracts with the word pandemic, or something related to viruses, but that's not found in most force majeure clauses. And there's a lot of discussion in the legal field about how the current COVID-19 circumstances apply to these often normal terms we see. One term that could apply is government regulation. We have regulations being issued by the state and by counties regarding what can occur. There's an argument that it could be an act of God, which is really intended to mean like an act of nature. That potentially applies, but it's not perfectly clear what specific terms or events in a force majeure clause apply to COVID-19. When this happens, there is a question as to what's going to occur next, and not every contract provision expressly addresses this. Who's going to be paying for additional costs? Are there going to be additional costs? For a service contract, the question is, do we pay the regular fees if we're not receiving the full or partial service? And then what's going to happen when the shelter in place is lifted? Are you going to be shifting services to another area that services is allowed to be performed? Or are you going to be postponing it or pushing out the term of the contract for an extra month to make up for this? A lot of questions are going to come up if you have a service contract that's not being performed because of a force majeure event. Bill is now going to give us a little bit of detail on what types of costs, or rather what type of events could meet the force majeure definition.
We consulted with a force majeure expert, and these are kind of the questions you need to answer to determine whether the COVID-19 would meet a force majeure test. So is it a natural event, act of God? As John said, that's maybe not. Is it unforeseeable when the project was bid? For projects that are ongoing or service contracts in place, I would probably say yes. Is it uncontrollable by the contractor? We would say yes. Is it an insurmountable event? We would probably say yes. Could it not be worked around? We're feeling that that's probably applies here. Not the fault of the owner. Significant disruptions of progress of work. So, basically in most areas, at least in Northern California, we had to stop work. Contractor unable to fill obligations, meet time, performance requirements, and as adjusted by change orders and various extension of time. So these are all areas where the experts on force majeure feel that COVID-19 meets these requirements.
Our next example is a construction example. And this clause is taken from an AIA contract. And if you're not familiar with those are relatively standard contracts that are pretty common in the construction industry because they have some generally agreed upon terms by professionals in the construction industry. In this particular section, it's not called force majeure, it's in the delay section, but it has the same intent as force majeure. This section says, if the contractor is delayed at any time in the commencement or progress of the work by an act or neglect of the owner or architect or an employee of either, or of a separate contractor employed by the owner. And here's where we get into force majeure. Skip over the next part. Or by labor disputes, fire, unusual delay in deliveries, unavoidable casualties, or other causes beyond the contractor's control. So that's where we're getting into potential force majeure issues, delays that are beyond the contractor's control. That could potentially apply to a force majeure type event like COVID-19 if it's beyond the contractor's control. They simply cannot do the work under the current governmental orders. The AIA contract also, if you read down further in this section 8.3, it talks about what do you do in the event of a delay to address the costs. And in the AIA contract, there's actually an extensive section on how the contractor could make a claim for additional costs incurred and how that is then decided upon. Under a more complex AIA contract, it's contemplated there'll be a construction manager, often an architect or professional construction manager, who would normally be approving change orders, approving invoices for payment. But in this case, when there's a claim for increased costs or even a claim by the owner, in this case, the association for a force majeure event, they make a claim to the project manager or construction manager, and that individual will decide whether or not an increase in costs or increase in time or some type of adjustment in the value one way or the other is appropriate in light of the force majeure event. So there'll be different ways these are going to be handled specific to each particular contract. And you also may find that not all contracts have a clause like this at all. It's really unusual to have a force majeure event. And so it's just not in every single contract. And as Bill mentioned early on, there are some what are called common law remedies if there is a frustration of the contract, if it's completely impossible and it can't be restored. There could be some other legal principles that could apply. So it's important to talk to legal counsel about how that's going to be affecting your particular project. Bill is now going to explain some actual costs that are related to these force majeure events and delays.
So some of the costs due to the project shutdown is the demobilization or remobilization. Originally, when the shelter in place started, and it was only a 2-week event, I think most contractors just stopped and left their sites mobilized. Some of the sites, because of the continuing issues with having site safety, site security, and things like that, some of the job sites have been demobilized since then, and there's an expense to that. We've also had a fair amount of weather protection issues, particularly during the first part of the shelter in place. We had quite a bit of wet weather, so there was weather protection issues that needed to be addressed, as well as having somebody check that on a regular basis. So there was an expense for the contractor and maintaining the site during that process. While all this is going on, as most of you know, the health departments, almost county by county, and at some point in time, some of them all gotten on the same page, but a lot of them have different ordinances in place. We had to go through and retrain our employees related to the COVID-19 issues. And it's been a fairly large curve. The IIPPs for COVID had to be developed county by county. They've been changing regularly. It's been an ongoing process for us on job sites that had to continue to run due to safety issues. And then just the rework of the site damage and stuff that happens just from vandalism, owners being home, in different things happening within the job site itself. One of the things that we have seen is material cost issues. Some of it has to do with shortages. We had a project that started when Napa reopened. We had a project start back up there. The asphalt batch plant in Napa shut down, and we had to bring in material from a different location, and there was a significant price increase for that. Labor increase and equipment costs. One of the things we're concerned about the labor side of this is whether or not all our crews will return, or there'll be a shortage of labor once everything does go back into full construction mode. We're seeing a lot of the projects that got delayed, particularly in the commercial end of the business, running their sites 24/7 now to try to get caught back up. which, pulls on the pool of available manpower. We also have issues now with families where they have children home from school, their daycare is not available, their school's not available. So one of the spouses needs to stay home and play school teacher. And that's also impacting people's ability to come back to work in the field as well. Equipment costs, it becomes an availability. We were just going through some of the equipment costs, on different things. And of course, everybody likes to take advantage of some situations. So things like hand washing stations for job sites, there was a fairly significant cost increase on those. We also have expense, related to equipment sitting on site during the shelter in place. We have ongoing insurance and bond costs. We've extended overhead with field labor working from home, indirect costs, just dealing with the whole pandemic and the additional work we had to do with our safety program, and then getting the projects restarted has been a challenge. There's a lot of different things going on related to that and the cost of safety. The safety costs for running a COVID job site, we've been running numbers on that this week. We have some job sites up and running, so we're trying to get some actual costs, but it's looking anywhere from like 7 to 10% of the contract amount in additional expense running a COVID-19 job site versus a regular job site.
Bill, what's a couple examples from say the Bay Area about how you're adjusting job sites? What are a few of the new requirements you have to have in place?
Well, we've had to run all our employees through safety training program. We've got to have additional wash stations. There's quite a bit of signage requirements that we have to do on the site that, is a big issue and an expense, and it changes and it's a little bit different sometimes county by county. So the other things we've had to do is all the Bay Area counties, as well as Sonoma County, require on jobs where we're working on 10 or more units to have a third party outside inspector come and to basically make sure that we're compliant with the COVID mandate at each job site. So there's an expense that we've had to add for that as well. In the morning, there's a whole check-in process we have to go through with the employees where they get their temperature taken. They have to go through a repeat of safety guidelines. They have to decontaminate the site at the end of the day along with all their tools. The project manager on the job has to keep copious amounts of records and notes on who's there, who comes and goes, and everything else. So there's a lot to the process that we've had to add to the job sites. And then the issue of productivity decrease due to having to work distance, wearing masks, the different things that they have to do to keep the job site safe. Mm. So what do you need to do? Well, I think the first thing you do is read your contract, see what it has to say. Talk to your legal counsel so you get an idea of what kind of exposure you might have on not only a construction contract, but a service agreement. Check the governmental orders. It really is a very much county to county thing. They all vary a little bit and they're all releasing things kind of at a different rate. So, and it's ever changing. And every time we look at this in our staff meetings and stuff, we've got different things to do. I'd talk to your vendors and contractors, find out what they're doing, make sure that they're complying with all the regulations in your area and they have all their safety protocols set up, as well as have all the PPE needed for their employees while they're on site, not only to protect the employee, but also the residents that are there.
So what this means is that work is going to be delayed, and I'm sure you've experienced that already. There's construction jobs that were put on hold, as Bill's explained. There's been work stoppages. Service performance has probably stopped. You may have seen adjustments in your landscapers. So there's going to be delays. And that's the whole point of the force majeure clause, is that excuses the delay. Under normal contractual terms, the contractor has an obligation to perform their duties by a certain period of time. So the first thing force majeure clauses do is that it excuses that time-based performance. You're still going to be able to do some work. but it's only essential work as defined by the state's order or the county. And as Bill explained, it's changing on a regular basis. Every time we do one of these presentations, by the time we write it and then speak about it, things have all changed. And by the time we finish speaking today and come next week, I'm sure it's going to change again. So it's constantly keeping up with that. It could mean some further construction delays and service delays also. As Bill mentioned, jobs are taking longer now. So even once work commences, we're still going to be going at a slower pace because it's an incredibly slow process to be able to get these COVID-19 procedures in place and then carry them out. And if you want to see some of them, if you go to most of the Bay Area orders, and you could even start with San Francisco, for example, at the end of their county orders, there's an Exhibit B or Appendix B. And it has restrictions for large jobs and smaller construction jobs at 10, in the distinguishing number, as Bill mentioned, is 10 units or more or less. And that can help you understand what is going into this. So it'll be important to start talking to your contractors about that, find out what they can do to keep up with work. It may mean shifting some work to do, the essential part of the job that can still be performed, and holding off on some of the other parts. Although now we're starting to see construction opening up a lot more, and that's not as big of a concern, but there still could be some things that have to wait. You could also have homeowners who simply say, I'm not comfortable with someone coming inside my unit right now to do work. And you're going to have to be able to deal with that and find out ways to work with that without exposing anyone to unnecessary harm, or exposing the association to liability.
Yeah, one of the things, John, on the if you go through the Appendix Bs, that they have it also, it's pretty well defined between interior and exterior work. It also talks about egress paths and stuff out of interiors and whatnot. But basically, for the property managers on the site, is to do interior work, you're basically setting up a containment area very similar to like a mold or asbestos abatement job. I mean, to set up a complete air barrier whenever possible to separate the work from the occupied unit. And at the end of the day, you have to what they call decontaminate the unit. So there's even extra processes here that we wouldn't have even in a mold abatement situation. So we're recommending at this point, unless interior work absolutely has to happen, that we hold off on that. And certainly why people are still sheltering in place, as you mentioned. Nobody's too excited about having us in their unit unless they've got some major problem. So
yeah.
The impact of the delays, I think, John, postpone projects. We're seeing some people postpone projects, particularly why everybody's home and sheltering in place, particularly ones that impact interiors. Increased costs, we've seen that already. We're monitoring that regularly. One of the things that hasn't really opened back up in every area is manufacturing. So there are some issues with material supply chains right now. One of the things that we're recommending is particularly projects with things like windows. A lot of the window materials, the hard materials, raw materials come out of Canada, even if the window product's manufactured here. So we're concerned also just about stuff being able to be imported into the country. We have additional OSHA and then the additional county health department mandates. Interesting enough, they don't line up typical of stuff being done by two different entities. So typically you have to go with the more stringent requirements. So sometimes you can read the county health department mandates, but then you have to go back to the OSHA mandates to understand all the different things that are involved in this.
So a few takeaways from this presentation today is to start a dialogue with the contractor and to see what ways you can start working for this and preparing for this. There's going to be some costs, and the issue is going to be who pays those costs, and it's going to depend on your contract, how it's written, what the costs are. But it's important to have that working relationship with your contractor, because ultimately most contracts could be terminated, and so keeping that relationship in place and keeping the work going is what's going to help achieve your goals of getting the job done. It's finding a way to make that work and to still comply with the contractual obligations. It's not clear what that's going to be. It's going to depend on each particular contract. So you have to look at your contracts and talk to your attorney about how you're going to be managing and dealing with that. Does all work need to stop? Not necessarily. Work is opening up now, so a lot of it that couldn't happen a couple weeks ago can start happening now. And even to the extent some work is limited, you can still find other ways to do the job. As Bill mentioned, doing interior work is not a great idea right now, and it should be avoided at all costs if you can. But if part of a job has interior and exterior components, you could look at, can we do the exterior part first? Can we change the order of the job? Not all things can be done that way. Some parts have to happen before the exterior parts happen. But if you can, work with your contractor on finding ways to get some work done, even if this other portions can't be done.
So I think one of the things you need to talk to all your service providers about is if they do have a COVID-19 plan, and what is that plan? And if there are extra costs attached to it, we're going to, as a matter of fact, we're on a bid walk this morning, and they were talking about the COVID-19 expenses and how we're going to incorporate that into our bid. So I'm recommending to most people is that they come up with a weekly cost attached to the COVID-19 plan, and that way, if everything gets lifted, it can be deducted out of the contract, and it would be a plan based off of what currently is mandated. If mandates change, there may be more expenses. It's always hard to tell. Hopefully, we're going the other direction. So I think that's the easiest way for the association to manage it, because you don't want to have all the COVID-19 expenses in the contract and then not be able to deduct those later. What are the costs going to be? Well, we're determining they're going to be somewhere between 7 and 12% probably of the contract value. It'll depend job to job, what's going on. Your service providers, where they send out one person to service the pool, may not have a lot of expenses, where the construction companies may have more. Painting contractors are going to be affected by this. Your roofers, pretty much every trade that works on your building is going to be affected by this. Janitorial staff is also one of the things that I know on some of the high-rise buildings and stuff, that's been a big expense that they've been dealing with on working with their employees in a safe manner on interiors as they've been going through this. And so there's a lot of different things. Your building type's going to make a difference. Your project's going to make a difference, and what the scope of work is.
So that wraps us up for our presentations today, but now we have time for some questions.
Please post your questions in the chat. We did have one question. Would you guys be okay if I sent out a PDF version of your presentation
Yes.
materials?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That was the first one we got. Anybody else have any questions for them? I'll give everybody a minute. Don't forget to send me a picture.
I had a
Selfie.
question.
Oh, yes.
Has anyone been fined yet?
For a COVID-19 violation?
Yeah.
There were some job sites that were shut down during the beginning of the shelter in place, where people were trying to deem their job essential. And I don't know if any fines were actually issued, but I do know that there was some jobs that were shut down early on. I haven't seen anything yet or heard
Okay.
as of yet.
Yeah, me neither.
All right. That was my question.
It's a good one.
Christine. Okay, I'm getting a lot of thanks, guys. Thanks, speakers. Great presentation in the chat. Okay, so I will get all those materials out to everyone who attended today. This will be on YouTube. Next week, we will be having a coffee break for the chapter, so please join us for that. It's where you actually get to be on video, and we get to see your faces, and we really love it, so join us. And then the week after that is our first full digital educational program. Thank you, guys, for speaking.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.